Hello, everybody, and welcome to this second lecture in our series of mini lectures that I'm doing on my book, Judaism, A Rational Approach. This lecture is entitled The Subjective versus the Objective, and in it we're going to examine some different types of evidence, how evidence should be viewed, what constitutes evidence, and what is the role of subjective feelings in this system and in this process. So let's get started. And if you recall, at the end of our first lecture, we ended on the question of how can we verify or indicate the existence of a creator and a divinely given moral value code, and the question of must we be able to see God with our own physical eyes in order to ascertain that he exists. If you don't recall how we arrived at this question, I refer you back to the first lecture, where in detail we describe the difference between our value system in society, the human relative model, where the bar is constantly moving based on what is comfortable for most of society, and between what would constitute an absolute value system if there was such a divine code that was given. And we ended on the question of, okay, so if there's this absolute system, what evidence is there for it? So I want to use an analogy from a criminal trial like we would present in the United States. There's lots of different types of trials. There's bench trials where only judges preside. There's civil trials. But for the purpose of this analogy, I want to focus on an example of a criminal trial that has a jury. Now, how is evidence presented to a jury? Most of the time, we don't have some type of smoking gun evidence in a trial, because if there was such a piece of evidence, the matter usually would not get to trial. There would be some kind of plea bargain made. So we get to trial when there are questions of fact that are in dispute, whether a person committed a certain act or did not commit a certain act when they were supposed to or when they weren't allowed to. And now we ask the jury to listen to evidence and to make a finding of fact based on this evidence. The nature of this evidence is usually cumulative, meaning the prosecutor in the case is going to introduce these different pieces, and these pieces are going to build to tell the story that he wants the jury to find as fact. For example, if we're talking about a murder trial, right, they're going to present, if they have DNA evidence, fingerprints, a murder weapon, a eyewitness testimony, video recordings, audio recordings, etc. Now, it's clear to us that nobody on the jury actually witnessed with their own eyes this person committing or not committing this crime. If there was such a person on the jury, then he would be a witness in the case. He wouldn't be able to be on the jury. So we're actually asking people that never saw something happen or not happen with their own eyes. We're asking them based on different types of cumulative evidence, some based on inductions and deductions of logic, to come to the conclusion that this person committed the crime. And of course, the defense attorney on the other side is going to do everything he can to try and poke holes in the story to make it that there is alternate possibilities for these events and sets of circumstances that occurred that don't point to his client as the one who committed the crime. Now, in our analogy, who is a tainted juror? A tainted juror would be someone who has a personal interest not to see a conviction. Let's say he's a family member or a close friend of the accused, right? So someone like this, the evidence to him does not matter because he doesn't want to see the person convicted. So in our analogy here, there are certain people that have already established a worldview. They decided that there is no God. They decided that the Torah could not possibly be true. And all the evidence in the world doesn't make a difference to them. So in that situation, really the evidence isn't relevant because the person's already decided based on their subjective feelings or their worldview or other certain evidence that they believe they've been exposed to, and they've already made a decision. So what's really important in this process is that we don't act like defense attorneys or tainted jurors, that we want to hear the evidence as an objective jury that doesn't have any skin in the game, that just wants to know what's the truth. Is there a creator? And did this creator provide a moral code or value system to human beings? And if so, we want to know if this is the truth and what is the evidence for this. That's how all the evidence should be viewed. If a person is already looking in advance to act like a defense attorney and just try to find different holes and different ways to poke holes in the evidence, there's always going to be an opening to find that. But what we really need to ask ourselves is, what is most probable? What makes the most sense? What is most likely? And that's really how we base our everyday decisions. How do we make everyday decisions? What process goes through our thought process do we go through when we make important life decisions? Let's take, for example, getting on a flight. All right? Most of us here can't describe fully how a plane even works. What is the engineering behind a plane, right? We definitely don't know who the pilot is. We don't have a personal relationship with the pilot. We don't know the people that are on the ground crew, whether or not they did their maintenance effectively, right? We know very, very, very little about what's going on behind the scenes at the airport with the planes. Now imagine you come at the counter, at the checkout counter, the check-in counter at the airline, and you say, look, I'm going to be on an airplane. We're going to be at 30-something thousand feet. And I really, really want to make sure before I get on this flight that everything is okay. So can you please show me the medical history and psychological and psychiatric history of the pilots that are going to be flying? I'd also like to see the security clearance of every ground crew member. And I'd like to see the maintenance records of the airplane. And after that, I'll take a look at all this and I'll decide whether or not I want to get on the plane. How do you think they're going to react to you there at the ticket counter, right? They're going to tell you, sir, the plane's fine. You want to get on? Here you go. Here's your ticket. If not, you can take a bus. But they're not going to provide you this type of information. And I don't know that there's ever been a person that's actually shown up to the airport and asked these questions. But if we think about it, we don't really know the answer to these questions. Yet, almost all of us feel comfortable getting on an airplane. Why is that? That's because we know that the probability of there being some type of catastrophic event or a plane crash is statistically very, very, very low. We know that statistically it's much more dangerous to get in a car and drive down the street than it is to fly in an airplane. So even though we don't have 100% of the facts, and we know that there is a small possibility, most of us feel very comfortable getting on an airplane. I'll remind you, there was that case, I think in 2015, where the Lufthansa pilot had a mental illness and he was very depressed, I believe, and he decided to crash the airplane into the Swiss Alps. He locked the door and decided to commit suicide with everybody on the plane. So it's not that this is not possible, it's just not likely. It's the same with business decisions. We make decisions based on what's most probable. When someone is going to invest in a certain property or in some type of business venture, they don't know 100% that it's going to succeed, but they look at the facts, they look at the different statistics, they look at the different information based or prospect based on whatever investment it is. And if based on all of this, it looks to them like it's going to be a good investment, they pull the trigger on it. So why should we have a different standard when it comes to the divinity of the Torah? When we want to look at if this document was given to us from the creator of the universe, we should apply the same standard that we would apply in our everyday life decisions, because there is no absolute proof. The idea of absolute proof is one that just doesn't exist, because anything and everything can always be questioned. So the real question is really, what is most probable? Just like a jury isn't asked to find absolutely, they're asked to find beyond a reasonable doubt. And this is the same standard that we should be applying when we're examining the evidence. Now let's examine the difference between an objective and subjective approach to evidence. Objective evidence doesn't care about our feelings. It relies on external, verifiable information. For example, if someone were to ask me right now, what's the weather in San Diego, California? If I were to respond that in San Diego, California, I feel that it's sunny and hot right now, obviously that wouldn't answer the question, because a personal feeling has nothing to do with what the actual weather is, right? In order to answer the question, I would need to connect to an external verifiable source, right? To go online, check weather.com to see what the readings are, and then I'd be able to give a correct and relevant answer to that question. Concisely stated, objectivity is driven by fact, while subjectivity is driven by emotion. Now let us apply this exercise to a very common statement. Someone comes and says, I believe that there is a God. Now, if a person believes that there's a God or not, right, and he's saying this from a subjective emotional place, that he has a feeling that he believes there's a God, that doesn't have anything to do with the reality to answer the question of if there is or isn't a God, right? A personal feeling has nothing to do with the reality of is there a creator or not, right? We're here in this world, and there's two options, two logical options. Either this world came into being by some type of chance, right? There was a big bang, matter appeared from nowhere, we don't know exactly how, and the world evolved over billions and billions of years. That's one option. Or that the world was intelligently designed and there is a creator behind all of it. There's no third position available, right? The universe is here. Either it was random or it was intentional and designed. So what does a person's feeling have anything to do with answering the question of whether or not the world was created or came into being by chance? This is a question that we need to connect to external verifiable information in order to give a relevant answer. So that's what we're going to be exploring in our coming lectures. We're going to be looking at what is the verifiable external information that we can connect to give a relevant answer or not on whether or not there's a creator and whether this creator gave to mankind a human value system. We're going to be approaching it from the objective side and not from a personal feeling, which is what we're used to when we talk about religion. And that's another issue that I want to address, is the issue of pluralism, the death of truth. I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, it's useless to argue about religion and politics. At a dinner table, when there's a family gathering and people that have different views, it's usually best not to bring up these topics, right? Because it's just going to cause arguments. Now, why is that? Because these arguments usually are based from a subjective approach. The modern grasp of faith and religion is a subjective one, right? A young man, for example, grows up in a home where he's taught a certain religion or a lack thereof, and now he goes out into the world and he meets people that have sometimes opposite views. Now, if they start arguing about or discussing these topics, most of the time it's not going to end well, because neither of them have verified the objective truth of their positions, right? We believe what we believe most of the time, not because we have verified its objective truth, but because we're predisposed to believe so in some way. So since their beliefs are more based on an emotional feeling rather than an objective fact, the conclusion that we come to, if it's a nice conversation, is, well, I respect your opinion and your worldview, but I don't see it that way. I believe something else. Now, pluralism has created tolerance, which is great, that everybody can explore for themselves and form their own worldview. But it has stifled the search for objective truth, because it's no longer the difference between a subjective and an objective conversation. It almost isn't recognizable anymore. The weight that is given to logic and to facts is minimal, because the other side can always just say, well, that's very nice that you've presented me with this information, but I don't see it that way. I just don't believe in that the way that you believe. And now the lines have been blurred between the reality of objective truth and subjective feelings and beliefs. And worse than this situation, where we can't recognize easily the difference between a subjective and objective approach is when a subjective argument is dressed in a garment of objectivity. For example, the documentary hypothesis, more commonly known as Bible criticism. Documentary hypothesis is not a form of hard science, yet it is presented as such by academics all over the world. It's taught in universities as hard scientific fact. Now, there's hard scientific fact, things that are measurable in a lab. This is not one of them. It's widely known that Wellhausen and Graff set out ahead of time to discredit the Torah. They had their worldview. They believed in evolution, and they said, okay, we've arrived here by chance. That means that the Torah could not possibly be divine because there is no creator. So they ignored the possibility of divine authorship, and on this base, this is their baseline. From this point forward, their entire analysis just assumed that textual differences indicate different authors. Now, many modern Bible critic scholars admit that there's no objective evidence for Wellhausen and Graff's theories. However, that doesn't stop academics around the world from teaching this to university students as hard scientific fact. Take, for example, Professor Umberto Cassuto. He wrote about the documentary hypothesis, quote, "This imposing and beautiful edifice has in reality nothing to support it and is founded on air." Professor Joseph Blenkinsop also wrote, "Documentary hypothesis has increasingly been shown to have serious flaws and no paradigm capable of replacing it has yet emerged." So when examining evidence, we need to be not just wary of the fact that we are taking an objective and not subjective approach. We need to be focused on objective sources that aren't dressing themselves up to be so based on a prior misconception or based on some type of prior worldview or agenda. So that's what we're going to be doing in our upcoming lectures. We're going to be looking into the pages of the Torah, and we're going to try to ascertain as much objective evidence that we can from the source material in order to answer these questions that we presented. And as a little type of exercise that I'd like to do before we get into the next lectures is I'd like to just go through a mental exercise of a few questions of true or false to get us thinking in the right direction. So first question, true or false? Nothing complex is created randomly, right? When we look at the most basic of inventions of mankind, right, even a plastic cup, we see that there was an intelligence and design behind this cup. The idea that there was a hurricane or, some type of accident or something blew up and a plastic cup appeared is ludicrous to anybody that has a reasonable mind. The more sophisticated this creation, the smarter the creator, right? So the person who created the camera or the microphone that I'm speaking to had to have studied a lot more, and it's a lot more complicated of an invention and creation than a plastic cup. So the more complicated the creation is, that tells us on the level of intelligence of the creator. True or false? Every man-made creation has a purpose. Everything that man has invented has some type of purpose, right? If someone builds a chair or a table or a washing machine, it's not random. True or false? The more something is necessary for our survival, the more readily available it is. What's the most elementary thing we need to survive? Air, right? Oxygen. Now, oxygen is available everywhere in the world, and it's absolutely free for now. I mean, at some point, they might find a way to charge us for the air we breathe, but at the moment, oxygen is available for all, and it's the most basic thing that we need. Now, we go up water, food. These things are more readily available. When we start getting into luxuries, those are things that become more scarce and are also a lot more expensive. So the more something is elementary for our survival, the more readily available it is. True or false? The blueprint or design always comes before the creation, right? The contractor doesn't show up and just starts randomly building a property, building a house. They have an architect design a blueprint, and then based on the blueprint, they work to build the house or the home or whatever it is that they're building. So the blueprint always comes first. True or false? Every device sold comes with a manual, right? Any small electronic device you go and you buy is going to have a little booklet that tells you how to turn it off and on and how to take care of it and how to use it. You buy something more complicated, like a new car, you're going to get a very large manual, a large book with hundreds of pages that nobody's ever read, right? The point is that everything that is complicated comes with some type of instruction manual. In Judaism, the Torah in Hebrew is milashon hora'ah. Torah literally means instruction. The Torah in Judaism is the instruction manual. The Torah says that God looked into the Torah and created the world, that the Torah is God's blueprint for the world. What we're going to be doing in the next lectures is we're going to be delving into this blueprint, and we're going to be identifying different types of evidence we have for the blueprint of the Creator, and evidence that this Creator provided to mankind an absolute moral value system. Thank you very much for listening today, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next lectures.